Marco Rubio walked into that briefing room like a man who already knew how the story ends. And what he said in the next 20 minutes didn't just shift the conversation inside Washington. It sent a message to every military planner, every foreign policy analyst, every intelligence official who has been quietly watching the Iran situation build for months. A projected timeline, a public declaration, and a deliberate, calculated decision to take ground troops off the table entirely. That combination doesn't happen by accident. So what exactly did Rubio reveal? And why does the specific framing of his words matter more than the headline? Because there's a version of this story the cable networks are telling. And then there's the version that actually explains what's happening behind the scenes. By the end of this, you'll understand why this wasn't just a press conference. It was a strategic signal designed to reach multiple audiences at once. And the people it was really aimed at weren't sitting in American living rooms. Let's start with what Rubio actually said, because precision matters here, and most of the coverage is already blurring the edges. He used the phrase projected timeline. Not confirmed, not certain, projected. That word choice is deliberate. In diplomatic and military communication, projected means we have a working operational estimate that is subject to conditions on the ground. It signals confidence without overcommitment. It tells allies we have a plan. It tells adversaries we've run the numbers. And it tells the American public something they haven't heard clearly in years, that there is an endpoint being actively calculated. That's different from open-ended. That word, projected, is doing enormous strategic work in a very small package. Now let's talk about the ground troops declaration, because that's the part generating the most reaction, and most of the reaction is missing the point. Rubio didn't say there would be no military involvement. He didn't say force was off the table. He specifically ruled out ground troops. That's a narrow but extraordinarily significant exclusion. It means the current framework is built around air power, naval assets, intelligence operations, and potentially special operations activity that doesn't fall under traditional ground combat deployment. That framing tells you something about the internal strategy that's been developed. Someone has been doing serious operational planning. Someone has looked at the scenarios and concluded that the objectives can be achieved without the kind of large-scale ground commitment that defined Iraq and Afghanistan. The confidence required to say this publicly, on record, with cameras rolling, suggests this isn't a political talking point. It's a briefed position. Here's what the timeline revelation actually means for Iran. When an American Secretary of State publicly announces a projected end date for a conflict, it does one of two things to the other side. It either signals that the pressure will lift on a known schedule, which could encourage waiting out the campaign, or it signals that the campaign is precise, targeted, and designed to achieve specific objectives within a defined window, which is far more unsettling to a command structure trying to plan its own response. The second interpretation is almost certainly the intended read, because announcing a timeline without specifying the timeline length means Iran knows the clock is running, but doesn't know when it stops. That uncertainty is a pressure tool. It's not a gift. It's a trap designed to force miscalculation. Let's pull back further, because this statement doesn't exist in isolation. It comes at a moment when the relationship between the United States and Iran has been operating under extraordinary tension for years. Sanctions, proxy conflicts, nuclear program negotiations that have started and stalled and started again. Regional military positioning building quietly while public focus stayed elsewhere. Rubio's announcement isn't a beginning. It's a milestone in a process that has been running in the background with very little public visibility. The fact that he chose to make this statement now in this format tells you the administration believes something has shifted in the underlying conditions. Either the intelligence picture has clarified, or the diplomatic channel has reached a decision point, or the military planning has reached a level of confidence that allows for public commitment, possibly all three. Now, here's the part that almost nobody is covering: the domestic political architecture of this announcement. Rubio is not speaking only to Iran. He's not speaking only to allies. He's speaking to a domestic audience trained by 2 decades of failed military engagements to be deeply skeptical of any American commitment in the Middle East. The explicit no ground troops statement is targeted directly at that skepticism. It's a preemptive answer to the question every senator and congressman will be asked the moment this conflict escalates. Are we sending our kids over there? And the answer, baked into the Secretary of State's public statement before the question is even asked, is no. That's not just messaging. That's political infrastructure for whatever comes next. It defines the boundaries of acceptable escalation in advance. Rubio just locked in the parameters of this conflict in a way that will constrain every future decision inside this administration. Commitments made publicly carry a cost to reverse. The allies are watching this very carefully too. America's partners in the region, the ones who have been making their own calculations about exposure and alignment and risk, needed to see something specific from Washington. They needed to see that the United States had a plan with an endpoint, not an indefinite commitment with no defined objective. A plan with a timeline and clear parameters. That's what Rubio provided. And for governments that have been hedging their positions, waiting to see which direction American policy would solidify, this is the signal they've been reading intelligence cables looking for. Watch how regional diplomatic postures shift in the next 2 weeks. Because they will. And when they do, Rubio's statement will be the inflection point everyone looks back to. Here's something nobody is saying out loud, but that sits underneath everything. The projected timeline announcement creates a window, a defined operational window. And windows have 2 edges. The front edge is where the pressure begins. The back edge is where either the objectives are met or the calculus has to change. Everything that happens between those 2 edges is now operating under a different kind of intensity than a conflict with no stated endpoint. Commanders have a clock, planners have a deadline, diplomats have a framework because both sides now understand there is a point at which the current phase ends. That doesn't guarantee resolution, but it changes the decision environment for everyone involved in ways that a vague, open-ended posture simply cannot. And here's where we land. Marco Rubio did not walk into that briefing room and give a press conference. He executed a strategic communication designed to accomplish at least 4 things simultaneously. Reassure the American public that this conflict has defined limits. Signal to Iran that the clock is running on a plan they don't fully understand. Lock in the domestic political parameters before Congress can complicate them. And give regional allies the clarity they needed to make their own alignment decisions. All of that in one statement, with carefully chosen words. The people who think this was a simple policy announcement are reading the surface. The people who understand how these statements are constructed are watching something far more deliberate. What happens in the next 60 days will tell us whether the projection was right, whether the strategy behind the words holds, the timeline is running, the parameters are set. And everyone is watching to see if the projection matches the reality. Because if it does, this moment will be remembered as the announcement that defined the shape of what came next. And if it doesn't, these words will be the ones everyone goes back to first. Either way, Rubio just committed. And commitments have consequences that outlast the moment they're made.